So our user service class encapsulates all the logic for making HTTP requests. Beautiful. Now, if we create another service class, let's say a service class for managing posts, that class is going to be almost identical to this class. So in that class, we'll have methods like get all posts, delete post, create posts, and so on. And the implementation of those methods are going to be almost identical to what we have here. The only differences are the endpoints and the objects that we send to the server. So let's use some TypeScript magic to create a generic HTTP service class. So back to our project, here in the services folder, let's add a new file called http-service.ts. Next, we go back to our user service module. We grab all the code, copy it, and paste it here. Now we're going to modify this code line by line. Anywhere we have a reference to user, we should either remove that reference or make it generic. So first we have the user interface. We don't need this here, so delete. Next, we need to rename user service to HTTP service. So here we press F2 and rename this to HTTP service. Similarly, we should rename this method to getAll to make it more generic. Now here we have a reference to the user interface that we just removed. Now, because we don't want this class to be coupled to a particular interface like user, we should replace user with a generic type parameter. So when defining this method, we add angle brackets and type t. T in this context is called a generic type parameter. It's a placeholder for a type. So when calling this method, we'll supply a generic type argument like getAll user or getAll post. You have seen this syntax before. Throughout the course, you have called many generic functions. But now we're defining a generic method instead of just calling it, okay? So delete. Now we replace user with t. So whatever we pass when calling the getAll method will be used over here, okay? Next, we need to supply the endpoint. Now here we have two options. One option is to add the endpoint as a parameter here. But the problem with this approach is that the consumer of this class has to provide the endpoint. That means in our component, we have to pass the user's endpoint. That's something we want to avoid, right? So let me show you a different approach. We remove the parameter. In this class, we add a property called endpoint of type string. Then we create a constructor, which is a function that is called when we create an instance of this class. We give the constructor a parameter called endpoint of type string. And here we initialize the endpoint property with the endpoint parameter. Now, if this part is confusing, don't worry about it. I'll come back to this shortly. Let's just move on and make this class generic. Then we'll come back and revisit the endpoint property, okay? So in this class, we have a property called endpoint. Now we can replace /users with this.endpoint. We're done with this method. Now we have a completely generic method. In this method, there is absolutely nothing about users, right? Now we need to make similar changes to the other methods in this class. So let's work on delete user. First, we rename this to delete. And over here, we need to add the endpoints and append the ID at the end. So I'm going to replace /users with this.endpoint. As simple as that. Now, let's modify create user. So we rename it to create. Next, we rename the parameter from user to something generic like entity. We should also change the type from user to t. And that means we need to add t as a generic type parameter. So here in angle brackets, we add t. And finally, we replace /users with this.endpoint. And the last method. We rename this to update. Make it generic. Then we rename the parameter to entity and set its type to t. Now, just like before, we need to add the endpoint followed by a / and the ID of the entity. So let's replace this with this.endpoint. Now here we have a compilation error because the TypeScript compiler doesn't know that our entities, which are instances of type t, have a property called ID. To solve this problem, we need to add a constraint to this type. We need to tell the TypeScript compiler that objects of type t should have a property called ID. The way we do this is using an interface. So let's go to the top. Here we define an interface called entity. And in this interface, we add a property called ID of type number. Now, in our update method, we tell the TypeScript compiler that objects of type T should extend the entity interface, meaning they should have the ID property. Now, if all of this is new to you, don't worry. With practice, it's going to become really simple. I've covered these concepts in detail in my TypeScript course if you want to learn more about this topic. Okay, so we're done with this class. Now, at the end, we don't want to create a new instance of this class because here we have to pass an endpoint. We don't want to hard code an endpoint like users because with this, our HTTP service will no longer be reusable, right? So what can we do? Well, instead of exporting an instance of this class, we should export a function for creating an instance of this class. So let's define a function called create. We give it a parameter called endpoint of type string. And here we return a new HTTP service with this endpoint. Now we export this function from this module. Okay, now let's go to the user service class. We're going to delete the user service entirely. So let's select the code, delete. Instead, we're going to import the create function of the HTTP service module. So import create from HTTP service. Now down here, instead of creating a new user service, we call create and pass /users as the endpoint. So this is the only place where we provide the endpoint. With this, we don't need to import API client anymore. It's not needed. Now we have an error in our app component. In fact, we have a bunch of errors because our user service no longer has a method like update user. Now the methods are generic. So we have update. Similarly, we should change create user to create and delete user to delete. There is one more. That is get all users. So this one should be get all. Now here we have a compilation error because the TypeScript compiler doesn't know the type of objects we're going to fetch. Now earlier we defined this method as generic. So look, get all has a generic type parameter. So when calling this method, we should specify the type of objects we're going to fetch from the server. All right, all the errors are gone. And now we have a generic and reusable HTTP service. Next time we need to create a concrete service class, like our user service. All we have to do is define an interface and call the create function to create a concrete service.